guys, it's Mrs. Anderson and I'm back with part 2 of our video lecture, and we are talking about sentences. Complete sentences, run-on sentences, and fragments. So to begin with, we need to discuss what a complete sentence is. A complete sentence is a group of words that expresses a complete thought. It always has a subject and a verb, often referred to as a predicate. And what a predicate is the verb in all of the words that follows the verb. So that's the predicate of a sentence. Now, a fragment is not a complete sentence. It is not a complete thought, really. Or sometimes a fragment might be missing a subject or a verb, and therefore it is difficult to understand on its own. There are 3 common types of fragments. The first is what is known as a dependent clause. A dependent clause is a group of words, and it actually has a subject and a verb, but it does not stand on its own because it is not a complete thought. And therefore, it is dependent on the sentence that comes before it. So in order for that particular portion of the sentence to make sense, you need that sentence in front of it. With a sentence that is a complete sentence, it stands on its own. You understand it even outside of its context. It makes sense. But with a dependent clause, it does not. These types of sentences generally begin with words like because or if or unless. These words are known as subordinating words. And additional words could be because, if, unless, when, whenever, while, although, that, which, or question words like how, who, what, or why. And it is the forming of these particular sentences that causes them to be fragments. Not every word that begins with that type of sentence is a fragment, but it's just the way that some of those sentences are formed. They're dependent on the sentence in front of it to make it make sense and to help it stand on its own. And it really cannot be a complete sentence. It's not a complete thought. Okay, moving on. The second type of common fragment is a verbal phrase. And as you know, a verbal is a word that looks like a verb, but it actually functions as an adjective in the sentence. And so when we have verbal phrases, especially at the beginning, you may think you have a verb in that sentence, but actually it is not a verb. So you're missing the verb of the sentence. And the third type is known as an appositive phrase. An appositive phrase is a noun phrase that renames or clarifies another noun. Again, you may be missing the subject of that sentence and you would not know because you have this appositive phrase in there. So here are a few examples. For a dependent clause, an example is who applauded every time he told a joke. Again, that makes no sense. We need to know, who did applaud every time he made the joke. There must have been some additional information that we don't know about. And that's often what happens in a fragment. You have this statement that's being made, but it makes you feel like you're on a cliff, like you're kind of hanging on for some additional information because everything isn't present. Remember, when you're reading your essays or you are looking at sentences, you should be able to say that statement, that sentence on its own, just read it by itself, and you should have all the information that you need if it's a complete sentence. Often when you read fragments by themselves, you know it's a fragment because it just is missing something. And then we do a little investigation and we investigate it a little bit and we figure out, oh, we're missing a subject, or oh, we're missing the verb, or this is a verbal and that's why it sounds like that. Another example of a dependent clause fragment is because he liked to make people laugh. Because he liked to make people laugh. We are, again, that's the because at the front, but we're missing who is the he who liked to make people laugh. and that makes this sentence a fragment. Some verbal examples: reading the mail. That's the sentence, reading the mail. And again, we're left kind of wondering, okay, reading the mail, what happened? What happened while reading the mail? So we have that sense of things not being complete. Another example is waiting for breakfast. Waiting for breakfast, what happened? So we need to make that sentence complete by adding additional information. An example of a positive phrase sentence is a dog around whom people need to guard their fingers in food. And you ask yourself simply, what about the dog that you need to guard your fingers in food? Information is missing. And so how do we know what's happening in that sentence? And it's very obvious that that sentence does not express a complete thought because we don't have the information. So the main thing we need to think about when we run into fragments is how to correct them. How do you correct a sentence that is actually not a sentence, that is fragmented? Well, as I stated earlier, a lot of times when you have a dependent clause or a verbal phrase or even in a positive phrase, it is dependent on the sentence that is in front of it. And so just by simply connecting those two sentences, we will make a complete sentence and we can express a complete thought. So a lot of times that's what you do. You remove that period and you might add a coordinating conjunction, a comma and a coordinating conjunction, which are our fanboys, or we might add a semicolon. Now, using a semicolon is not necessarily tricky, but there are a couple of rules that goes with it. You can only use a semicolon if you have similar structure, meaning that the sentences are formed similarly in the sense of Jane ran down the road, Sam ran down the road, or Jane ran down the road and Jane saw a dog. We might use a semicolon there, or we might use a coordinating conjunction. So that's one way to fix a fragment. Another way we may fix the fragment is just, again, to add it on to the sentence in front of it. And sometimes you may need a coordinating conjunction in a comma, and sometimes you may not. Sometimes just adding it on would suffice. And then other times you may need a transitional word. It just really depends on the sentence. But generally, by joining those two sentences together, you can fix the problem. So let's talk about run-on sentences. A run-on sentence is connecting two or more sentences, but they're not connected correctly. So a common run-on would be like a comma splice. Some people just will throw a comma in there and think, oh, okay, now I fixed this. And technically, a comma does not stand on its own. It cannot combine two sentences together or two statements together. It cannot combine a dependent clause to an independent clause. It does not have that power. And so you will see that time and time again. Or we'll just write a whole bunch of words together, and because it's coming to us in that particular format, often the way we would write a speech or the way we would speak it, we tend to have lots of run-on sentences because of that. And so what we can do to fix that is add in a period and just break off the sentence, figure out which parts are complete sentences and form those sentences, and then capitalize the next sentence and form a new sentence. So breaking them into smaller sentences will help us from having run-ons in our writing. Again, we can add, with a run-on, we can add the comma and a coordinating conjunction, one of the fanboys. We can do the semicolon, we can add in a semicolon, and we can add it on to the dependent, we can add the dependent clause onto the independent clause to help it make sense and for it to be a complete thought. And those are the basic ways of fixing any type of fragment or any type of run-on sentence. In your homework, you will be identifying run-on sentences, fragments, and complete sentences. And my suggestion for you is when you're looking at a sentence, always look at that sentence and figure out, is there a verb and is there a subject? Once you figure that out, and that can be fairly easy, again, look for your action, include your helping and linking verbs, and then ask yourself who or what is doing that action. And then if you have someone doing that action, then you have a subject. If not, then that's the part that's missing, and you may need to put a subject in there so it can make sense. You may need to combine it with the sentence that was previous so it can make sense. We'll have to do some type of sentence reconstruction to fix that sentence. The other part I would say with the fragments is say them out loud. If you think a sentence may be a fragment, go ahead and say it out loud and see, does that make sense? Does that express a complete thought, or is it because I know what the sentence before it said that I now have filled in the gaps for this particular sentence? So it can get a little bit tricky, but I have faith in you guys that you guys will be able to figure it out. And of course, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me either via email or you can text me. I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, and I will post your homework. See you soon.